Welcome to the Power of One. Today, I am so excited. I have Kristin Henning on the show, and we are going to unpack her book. But Kristin is a defense attorney, and we're going to dive into the book to see exactly what gave her the inspiration to write this uncensored book. Welcome to the show, Chris.
Thank you so much. I'm really, really happy to be here and happy to have this conversation with you about such an incredibly important topic.
And that's true. And that's true. And I opened the book and I was just floored by the first example in the book, which are very real about and things that we're faced with every day. So I know you're a defense attorney, so people know my love, my passion is with victims and co-homicide survivors. So I will move a mountain for them. I'm always fighting for them. But don't get me wrong, I connect with the Defenders Association and they help me. Anytime anyone calls me and they need help, I will always help them. I will never turn them away. But I used to always ask the question, okay, let's look at crime coming out of Philly. Are people selling drugs because they have to or because they want to? Are these youth getting in trouble? Why? I don't feel as though we're always asking the question why. And in Philadelphia, it's so heartbreaking because I've served mothers whose 15-year-old or 14-year-old or 13-year-old was shot to death. And I mean, they were shot multiple times. So there's things that our youth are dealing with, and we're not asking the question, why? But in the book, in the beginning of your book, you speak about an African-American young man that just did something on a whim. And then there's a Caucasian young man who kind of did the same thing. But within the criminal justice center, they wanted to lock up the African-American young man and the Caucasian young man. Let's put him in chemistry class.
Yeah.
Speak about that experience and how that opened your eyes and how it made you come to write the book and for you to be able to fight for our young African-American young men and women. Actually, before you do that, let's start from the beginning. Tell the viewers a little bit about your educational background and your work history.
Yes. So I'm from I'm from Rocky Mount, North Carolina. So I am a Southerner at heart. I was raised in a family of teachers and preachers, all of whom were deeply committed to working with young people in some capacity. Young people who were less fortunate, had less opportunity, less resources than I grew up with. So that's my frame of reference, right? And then, when I was a freshman in college, I had an opportunity to serve as an apprentice in a local juvenile court in Durham, North Carolina. And when I will never forget the day when I walked into that courthouse building and I am heading down the hallway towards the juvenile courtroom, and I see a line of children shackled together by their arms and by their legs being escorted to that courtroom. And I was just blown away. I stopped dead in my tracks. Growing up in the South, all I could think of was Roots, that documentary about the enslavement of Black folks. And I was like, I could not imagine that we shackle children in contemporary society. So that was like a huge moment for me. I walk into the courtroom itself. I sit down next to the prosecutor because my internship or apprenticeship was supposed to be with the prosecutor's office. And I, looked at the prosecutor. I pointed across the room and I said, you know what? I really want to be over there. And I was pointing towards the defense table. And so I really respect your comments, your opening comments, when you talked about having a heart for victims, but yet sort of understanding the importance and central, necessity of having due process of law and defense attorneys who would adequately represent children. So that was really my aha moment. And that's how I ended up, going to law school, after I graduated from undergrad, specializing in youth justice issues, even as a law student, graduated from law school, did a fellowship for 2 years, focused again on youth justice. And then by the time I went to the DC Public Defender Service, I knew that I wanted, yes, to be a criminal defense attorney, but to specialize in children. And so for the last 26 years, I have been doing just that. Representing kids in juvenile court, mostly in the District of Columbia. So, you asked me about that story, right? That
Mhm.
opening story in my book. And I'll tell you, when I talk to people about the arrest, the prosecution, the incarceration of children in America, people automatically assume I must be talking about those serious violent offenders that we hear about on television and that you work with, their mothers of children who have been killed by another child. That's what people assume, rape, murder, carjacking, robberies, gun cases. And so I have to tell you that people are shocked to learn that there is a small percentage of children, yes, who are in the courts for those types of offenses, but the vast majority of children in today's juvenile courts are there for what we call normal adolescent behavior. And
Mhm.
so my book is all about the ways in which we have criminalized a
Mhm.
certain demographic of society, specifically Black males, right?
Mhm.
Or Black children. I won't even limit it to
Right.
males by any means, right? So it's the rage of innocence, how America criminalizes Black youth. And my decision to like write this book and to tell, I open with that story is I have been representing kids for 26 years. And every single child that I represent, with the exception of 4, has been an African American child. So I've only
Mhm.
represented 4 white children in 26 years, which is just unfathomable in contemporary society. Right here in Washington, D.C., for people who aren't here, you might think that there are no white children in the nation's capital or that white children do not engage in, delinquent adolescent criminal behavior. And the answer is also not true. And so my moment was, I call him Eric in the book. There was a young 13-year-old boy, Eric, on a Saturday evening. He was watching a movie. In the movie, somebody made a Molotov cocktail. In his little 13-year-old brain, he thought, ooh, that looks cool. Let me see if I can make something that looks like that. He didn't research it. He didn't ask anybody how to make it. He just went into his kitchen, grabbed a glass bottle, and began to pour in whatever liquids he could find: pine sol, bleach, all these water soluble products, right? He then takes a piece of toilet paper. It's my favorite part of the story. He sticks the toilet paper in the bottle and lets it hang out over the edge. He then closes up the bottle so that it looks like a wick and a Molotov cocktail. Now, you and I know that toilet paper is going to burn out before it even got to the top, but he wasn't even trying to burn it. He put that bottle in his book bag so it would not spill out on his mother's white carpet.
Mhm.
This is on a Saturday evening. He forgets all about it. Monday morning comes, he goes to school. Mom drives him to school. He gets out, he puts the book bag in the metal detector because so many school systems today have metal detectors. He puts the bag in the metal detector. A school resource officer sees the bottle and says, "What is this?" Eric immediately says, "Oh, that's nothing. You can throw it away." Wasn't even trying to keep it. He went on about his business, went to class. Next thing you know, this was the beginning of a 9-month ordeal. This child got arrested, pulled out of class, arrested in the hallway, escorted down the hallway, taken to secure detention, held overnight, formally prosecuted the next morning for attempted arson. for non-water, for non-flammable objects, right? He gets prosecuted for attempted arson and for possession of a Molotov cocktail. So this is my client, Eric. So as you noted, sometime later, a couple of months later, how many ever months later, I'm giving a talk in Connecticut. And during that talk, I share Eric's story. Well, a white woman comes up to me afterwards and she says, you know what? My son did the exact same thing. And I asked her, so what happened to him? And she says that the school put him in advanced chemistry classes. It was just a watershed moment for me, as long as I've been practicing, and never heard quite that extreme of a contrast. So this child, this white child in Connecticut, is being rewarded for his creativity, his intellect. Let's use this and channel this in a way that will be productive and exciting for you. And my client, who was literally 13-year-old boy, just being a teenager, was securely detained and criminally
Yeah.
punished.
That's
And it just,
that's
it was a watershed moment. It said so
yeah.
much about the criminalization of normal adolescence, about the different ways in which we perceive and respond to
Mhm.
Black children. It says a lot to me about the ways in which school is not for Black children, many Black children, an academic, creative, intellectual enterprise, but instead, a place to be scrutinized, surveilled, and treated like a criminal. So many lessons in that story.
And it's horrible. And then I read on, and then I saw where you had wording in there that in the 1990s, that judges, there were laws that were passed where judges can inflict harsher sentencing on juveniles, and we know that affected young African American men again. And speak to that.
Well, so really important moment in history that in the 1990s that impacts everything that we're seeing today in contemporary society. So there was um, really, I almost want to tie it to police in schools and the evolution of police in schools, which I will say, I grew up believing, even as a criminal defense attorney specializing in youth and adolescents, I grew up believing the often repeated narrative that we have police in schools today because parents and teachers were afraid to send their children back to school after the mass shooting in Columbine, Colorado. But when I began to do research for this book, I realized that the first police in schools appeared in 1939
Oh,
in
wow.
Indianapolis. Yes, in Indianapolis, in response to the earliest even inkling of a conversation about inkling of a conversation about integrating schools. Fast forward to the 50s and 60s in the civil rights era, and you see a massive increase in the number of police in schools in response to, and I should put it this way, that police officers were sent to school under the guise of providing safe passage for Black and Brown students who were going to integrate schools. But we know from the historical record and from the iconic photographs that police officers really in that era became an impediment to meaningful integration of schools. So now you ask me about the 1990s. Fast forward to the 1990s. And what is going on in the 1990s? Well, there was a temporary uptick in criminal behavior, in crime across our country, and especially in urban areas like New York and the like. And a scholar, a professor, created a term, coined a phrase, the super predator. And this was really, when I say watershed moment in history, this was the moment where Black children were explicitly named as the perpetrators of criminal activity. And the prediction was that Black children would run amok by the year 2000 and rape, maim, and kill all of America. That was the super predator. Well, if anybody knows history, you know that actually right after that prediction, this super predator myth, crime plummeted in our country, went straight back down. But the label super predator myth or the super predator stuck, and laws in all 50 states were changed to make it easier to prosecute children as adults, to impose more serious and severe sentences on children for all manners of crime, not just like the crime that they were worried about. So this error, which was truly a temporary uptick in crime, has had lasting effects. No state has repealed those statutes, and in fact now use them to try and prosecute children as adults, which is a significant harm to the child. It does not achieve the goals of public safety, which is what I know these laws were designed to do. And in fact, they inflict trauma, they increase crime instead of reducing crime. So there's nothing to be gained. And I say that, even understanding victims' rights, right? And even having an appreciation and respect for victims' rights, that what we think we want, right, is retribution and accountability. But for children who are impulsive, reactive, engaging in adolescent bravado, peer influence, often are not redirected by the severe sentences that we think of. In fact, we are cultivating young people to engage in more serious crime than instead of having a rehabilitative response to young people, which is what we should do, even when they engage in serious offenses.
I like that you speak to pretty much every youth situation in your book. So we speak about Eric, who had coming from a loving household, did not have any trauma or anything in that nature. Now we move on to that young adult who is traumatized and who may have a mental illness.
Right.
So here it is, you traumatize this young person again for whatever they did, going through the criminal justice system, and then you try them as an adult, and then you put them in an adult prison.
That's right.
And in your book, it speaks about young African American men who are now among adults who may rape them, who may physically abuse them.
That's right.
How do we change this system, or what can be done? And are there services within these prisons that will help those who were traumatized before they were sentenced and who have mental illnesses?
Yeah, such great questions. I mean, my answer to how do we work with these children in the first place before they ever get to the prison is really a call for a public health response to adolescent crime. So a public health strategy for school safety and for community safety. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is a framework for safety that focuses first on cultivating meaningful, healthy relationships between children and adults, right? So that adults are mentoring, supporting, advocating for children to get the resources that they need. It's a framework that is trauma informed. That means it's a framework that recognizes that so many children, so many young people in contemporary American society are suffering from trauma, and that the percentage of young people who are suffering from trauma has only gone up since the pandemic, since the racial unrest associated, tied to, following after the killing of George Floyd, the political unrest. And we are fooling ourselves if we think that our children are not watching, the political drama unfolding in front of them. So, but the trauma is real. In addition to, as you noted, children growing up in communities with poverty, with the loss of parents to COVID, the loss of parents to cancer, parents who are incarcerated, hurting, depressed. So we've got to have a framework that really provides a continuum of trauma-informed care for young people in their schools, in their community, in their families. The third sort of pillar, if you will, of a public health framework is one that is restorative. It recognizes, right, that young people are already living in broken relationships. So how do we repair the broken relationships between really law enforcement and African American communities? How do we restore, broken communities between school systems that are quick to expel and suspend, discipline children instead of serving them in their community and in their schools? So there's a lot of broken relationships. There's also broken relationships within community, right? From neighbor to neighbor. Like, what can we do to restore broken relationships? And then the fourth pillar is the framework has to be racially just. I always ask people, how many of you think that our children of color, Black, Latinx children of color, are not aware of how differently they are being perceived and treated in society? And so that always undermines that perception of discrimination and injustice, right? That perception of injustice undermines any effort that we might make to rehabilitate and support children. So we've got to grapple with all of those. At a very concrete level, that means we need a continuum of mental health services at school. We need vocational opportunities for young people. We need social emotional learning in the school curriculum. We need peer intervention, restorative justice programs. In schools where there is real violence, we need violence interrupters, credible messengers, folks who look like those young people who will go in and mediate a truce. So there's a range. We need to call 988, which is the new sort of mental health crisis number, right? Not 911 every time there is, a reaction. We need behavioral psychologists in the school. So those are the ways in which we need to grapple with, get at this problem before they ever get to prison. And in prison, I almost feel like it's never too late. I want to say it's too late. It's never too late. But you also have to have, you really cannot have children in jails and prisons with adults, right? And in the rare circumstances where you do, until we can change those laws, they've got to be separated and segregated, and treated and served with psychiatric, psychological services. That's what's got to happen. I mean, as you noted in my book, I talk about children who commit suicide in prison, male and female. It's not a safe place to be.
I love that you are somewhat mentoring, not somewhat, but are mentoring and helping young African American males on how to deal with racism and how to deal with things that are present in their face that are hard to deal with. So I know you being where you are as a professional African American woman have been faced with some things, and so have I, and it hurts. But see, as an adult, and I know how to deal with conflict and I know how to deal with it in a professional manner. But speak to that, because I love how you are helping them deal with that, because it hurts.
That's absolutely right. And I always say, like, it's male and female, right? Like, I go out of my way in the book to like weave together Black boys and Black girls, all of whom are hurting. And you're absolutely right. I think in one of the chapters, I talk about how difficult, to be quite frank, it is to be a Black parent trying to help children navigate exactly what you described, which is, on the one hand, preparing children in advance for those inevitable moments of discrimination. Right. And so the idea is to let them know these things may happen at school, in recreation, in the community, with police officers, in healthcare, and that they have to be ready for it, while also not so over preparing them that they become afraid, right, to walk out in society, so that they're not so afraid that they think that there are no allies, white allies, or allies from other communities, or that they think they can never have a conversation with the police officer, right? So it's a very delicate tightrope that parents and mentors, as you put, coaches, counselors, teachers have to walk in guiding, Black children along that way. And so I think a couple of things, one of which is creating space for children to talk about it, right? Like creating space to talk about how they have been hurt and what they've seen and what they're worried about, right? Before they even walk out the door. So creating that space and creating, an opportunity to get therapy, maybe family therapy together so we can work through it. But also reminding them that like, this is the place where Black history, race pride is really valuable. Reminding them that guess what? Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and so many historical Black leaders suffered the same type of discrimination that you're talking about, that you're beginning to see, and that you will experience, but they overcame, right? Mm-hmm. And so part of the strategy is giving the talk. The talk says, do whatever you have to do to get home safe. Be respectful. Be, don't talk back. Don't do any sudden movements. You educate your children, mentor your kids so that they can get home safe, and then immediately create an opportunity for them to have some meaningful recourse, whether it's writing a letter to the police department, whether it's writing an op-ed, whether it's forming a club at the school that has an opportunity to speak up, at school. There are so many ways to engage young people around these issues, short of short of them getting into a fight with a police officer. But having said that, I also want to really make the point that the other thing that we as adults have to do is to let children vent and respond like children. And so people ask me all the time, what does the title of your book mean? The Rage of Innocence. And I tell people, one, it is the rage that all of us should have when any child is deprived of an opportunity to be a child. But it is also the rage that any normal, healthy Black child with an ounce of self-respect, an ounce of dignity, right, an ounce of self-worth has when they are labeled, isolated, and treated as if they're a criminal, right? And so a person with an ounce of self-esteem is going to speak up, and they're going to talk back and reclaim that identity. And so I tell people all the time, you can't expect a young child of any race to walk up to a police officer and say, Mr. Officer, I don't like the way you're treating me today. That's not the way it happens. Children are impulsive and reactive and emotional. And so we have to let them speak out and vent and share the way they do.
Well, I think that everything was well said, and I thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm so happy to have been here, and I hope we'll continue the conversation.
Thank you so much for joining me today. I encourage you to go and purchase this book. Just like Chris, we all need to take a stand. We all need to fight for our young African American men and young African American women. They deserve our love and respect. Peace and blessings.